I feel like making a long recording about a whole lot of things. I have two recordings that I want to make. This is often the problem, and so then I kind of transpose them, and it's awkward. But let me think. So I wanted to talk about the tragedy of the commons, which is a tragedy, and then you must also understand that the tragedy of tragedy itself, you know. And the kind of and the somewhat the secret in to all tragedy is that the mystery should be finished of the gods, and the way to finish the mystery of the gods is taking tragedy to be defined as that the gods decide man's fate, whereas a comedy is that man decides man's fate. So that's the difference in style in genre between tragedy and comedy. In plays, at least, in narrative and plot. And so the way to expel the tragedy is to see that the gods do not decide man's fate, that it's all a dark comedy in secret. But then to know that requires you to know thyself. And to know thyself, you must actually also know a bit about those around you, in some sense, because we somewhat share an unconsciousness. And so as your human unconsciousness is co-tethered to a whole field of communal values, city values, because we all have a vanity subjecting the same in hope, and then the same to us is also different because we do not have the exact same internal constitutions. And to know thyself means to know the distinction between these structures of schematization within the psyche, within the substrate of the metaphysic as well, that allows for the consciousness to appertain to whatever it is progressing and being itself in whatever form of identity that it is at least transitioning through, or that it perhaps at basic, at some kind of basic sense of self, what are we? What are you in yourself? And those are inextricable separate subjects. What are we and what are you in yourself? We must know both to know either. So that is somewhat also the mystery of the unconscious, which is a requisite learning grounds to make any real headway to overcome the gods. And in some sense, this comes back to my sort of twin quest, which is the purification of the hard power of the legal tradition, of the legal theory, and a rehabilitation of the soft power, which is in some sense the soft guiding sort of knowledge source which should be there in society for people to draw from, which is the knowledge of psychology, so that people cannot get away with some kind of false authority in court to use their expertise to somewhat invalidate the proper scope of free choice and self-determination, albeit as irresponsible as it may be. People may say, well, I choose to reject your psychology, I choose to even reject your law, and the law will even tolerate you until you cross a boundary, and then it must stand firm to its own stricture, to its own structures, lest it invalidate itself, lest it have no confidence in its own structure and its own edifice. Anyway, this is not a game of anarchistic chicken at the end of the day. That is not the basic prime component of the human condition. It's not some kind of hard, skeptical sort of sophistry and table-thumped, sympathy extraction of, well, aren't we all prone to this hard skepticism, so anything that can only be grown and cultured from that denigrating petri dish of human morality or amorality or nihilism, whatever you want to call it, or in some sense the highest values devaluing themselves. But anyway, let's not go around in circles. Let me stick to my topic. That my topic today is to talk about what the real commons are and to disabuse them of their historical context, because they do have an historical context that needs to be distinguished from the properties, the true properties of the commons, because the properties of the commons in the historical sense are validly tragic. They are validly prone to the tragedy of the commons. So how can it be, how can the commons function if they are subject to tragedy? And in some sense, if we actually scan the history well enough, then we'll know that in some sense there is this inextricable connection between the commons and the divine right of kings. That the divinity, the concept of divine and the sovereign are inextricable to the concept of the commons. That in some sense the only proper commons that could ever function was through some kind of collective authoritarian force, which the divine right of the king was sort of symbolically inhabiting. And the commons were not even referred to as the commons until after Cromwell or something like that. So that's a kind of a historical misnomer, that the commons were always originally the king's lands. And you were allowed a certain dispensation. You could go into the king's lands and you could take from the king's lands 5 pigeons or 5 birds or something like that. But you weren't allowed to hunt a stag or something like that. Or maybe at some festive time, at some seasonal dispensation, at some special, exceptional, or sort of not in some kind of consistent free roaming, free reign and free utility of the commons. The commons were never that free. And this kind of cookie cut solution was how in the anachronism of these things, how the tragedy of the commons was managed or curtailed in a kind of spiraling toxicity. And then there were obviously those who took liberties with the king's land, and then they grew fat and they got extra protein, and in some sense there was always this uneasiness that and then already you have this very mixed approach, which allows us to never synthesize a more palatable cultural settlement. Now, anyway, this is something that private property I do think in some sense does solve, because you cannot just have private property. You can have private property that is privately contained within a trust, that has a trustee, that has a constitution, that has a mandate, that has a trustee. So, there are forms of collective ownership. And then they will have rules, and they will have something and something and something. And they will have their own ethos built into them, and they'll have their own managerial style. So I don't see why there is an intrinsic tragedy of the commons. What there is an intrinsic problem is that people don't know how to get along with one another. They don't know how to compromise. They don't know how to come up with a good idea that can simulate the commons. They don't know. They're not as civilized as they want to, look at. And look, there is, to get into this kind of ephemeral complication, the idea that essentially the basic commons is the atmosphere or something like that. I do think that symbolism is very deep indeed, and is also much more far-reaching. That obviously, you don't want to pollute the commons with noise pollution, because then you can't have a town crier. You can't have, people getting up on their soapbox every once in a while and broadcasting something that should inform the public discourse, perhaps, or something like that. So sound pollution and atmosphere is, I think, quite a good thing. And we know where this exists in modern times. We've kind of solved this. It's the internet. The internet and the moral space, the moral atmosphere, which is also much cohabited by legal tradition and legal theory and municipal legal stricture. These are the proper place of the commons. And obviously then when we see people encroaching against the internet, encroaching against big tech censorship and such like that, and who are the political proponents of that kind of big tech censorship? It's the democratic establishment proper, more so than anything else, or perhaps also with the kind of secret underhanded help of Mitch McConnell trying to take gripes at Section 230 instead of trying to reform it. It's always been that is the real, let's say, encroachment against the commons, and quite a dangerous encroachment as well, but that in some sense seeks to cut off our own ability to know ourselves through ourselves freely, that we have to go through the gated narrative gatekeepers and the mainstream traditional media and such. Anyway, so I just want to, these are things that are I'm somewhat repeating myself quite a bit, and a lot of these things are very trite, but what should I say? So, and I would just to go back to my moral point here, I think that if we listen to the prophecy of Carl Jung, when he told us of the drowning king in the cave of the underworld, which I do believe that you should regard it in the Platonic metaphysical sense of that setting, because Carl Jung was an alchemist, and and I do believe that the drowning sovereign, the drowning king in the underworld, is in the larger section of the divided line, is the realm of the intelligible. That in principle, would we rescue the sovereign from the pool in the cave, who's drowning in the cave? And he gives a promise. He says, to those who would rescue me, for anyone who will rescue me, I will place in his right hand the morning star. I can't remember if there was something else as well, but anyway. But who will rescue the concept of the sovereign morality? And instead we have pretenders who sing their disgusting somewhat songs, well, what was her name? Lord. And we'll never be royals. Well, if you don't want to be a royal, that's fine on you, but then you should really, you can't inhabit a commons, or at least not an the only commons you'll ever be given is a commons that is adjacent to some kind of tyrannical, authoritarian principality. In the sense of co-owning it. A lot of these things, I'm not trying to make hard and fast materialistic sort of promises and strictures and things like that, because a lot of these things, obviously it would be nice if we had a good cultural settlement and people could grow in their own immaturity into such a paradigm. And I'm just going to babble and repeat myself, I guess, but yeah, so the commons is inextricably linked to the concept of divinity, but more so to the concept of the sovereign. Because if we don't want to be ruled by the gods, and if we don't want our fate to belong to the gods, then we must transfer it into a comedy. And we must realize that our humor needs to be broader than people expect. Our humor cannot be a sympathetic, simplistic humor, a simp humor, an oversimplified humor of a rotten soul, of a dead soul, of a and this, I mean, I don't wish to offend people, but this is the concept that I keep on bringing up of this spiritual lesbianism, in some sense, that we can just all go along to get along with our hollow souls, with no spiritual activity, with no reason, with no independent discerning. We don't need to understand, we just need to be bestowed some kind of extracted dignity, which is not dignity, it's just sympathy that's hedged on some disgusting narrative extraction. The other point is that you know, and I mean, I've tried to explore this by talking about things like the peasants are revolting ambiguity. Are the peasants revolting? Are the peasants revolting? Sorry, I should have put an and in there. Are the peasants revolting, and are the peasants revolting? Because those are two separate questions, and we cannot just conflate them into, well, if they're revolting, then they must be in the right somehow. There must be something about them that it needed to happen, or something like that. You know, this complete irresponsible derogation of the destination to some kind of fatalism, to some kind of scapegoating, to some kind of and this, in a technical sense, has a lot to do with the difference in the problem of just because something seems to be computable does not mean it's a valid way of deriving an answer. Just because you've found a logical method to kind of render to you an answer doesn't mean that it's a legitimate anyway, you know, this is what happens when you use identities that are fundamentally intractable in your workings out, and then you don't sort of realize that your whole reductive modality of sort of oracle I mean, you know, maybe you can get involved with some mystical things like oracles, but, you know, you better be in for it for the journey and not for the ends, because you don't deserve the consequence without the understanding of the process. Because really, then you're just making yourself a new kind of animal, a new kind of beast, a new kind of conditioned and printed abrogation of your own self-determinism and responsibility. You've just concocted a new false consciousness, a new culture of self-denigration and self-delusion, tacitly woven and such, into the tapestry of your bloody history and your bloody excuses for why the history was necessary or something like that. So much so that you can't even see the egregious opportunities that were there if you had just opened your field of inquiry. Broadened your reductive, formulaic, tactical anyway, I better stop this recording. I won't be able to for a while. Okay, let me think if there's anything else I could say about this topic. Probably not that much. So what can I say? That in some sense, the commons is a sword, and it's a sword that must cut both ways, and is much closer to the concept of justification and morality. And that is, in some sense, you could even say that, I guess I don't want to say might makes right, because it's not that, because the justification is certainly above and below might as well. It's beyond and also sometimes within the concept of might. There's no fixed correlation between might and justification, but there is a kind of weird sort of symbolic, metaphysical pattern and relationship that one can sort of discern perhaps. But the you know, in the same way that the fool and the king are both rulers in kind of the entire society, and in some sense the one is the shadow of the other. That in some sense, wherever there was a failed monarch, there was also a failed court jester that did not educate the monarch in the width and the breadth of the undercutting depravity and, you know, and squalor, but also the nobility of the common folk and such, and how to tend to this dynamic conundrum. Because there was a huge public good that was proffered by the station of the sovereign and by the propaganda of the divine right of the sovereign, that could not have been attained to. You know, and in some sense that's something like the beginning of the social contract theory. And I mean, many of the sovereigns, even especially in Western Europe, took that very seriously because they did use themselves like chattel. They married each other like chattel in order to engineer perhaps a vision of stability between sovereign nations and such. But sorry, let me find that thread again. So what was it talking about? That and that gave us a history of sovereignty to look back on and to examine and to try to understand the complexities of these moral dilemmas. If we merely would have the empathy to condescend ourselves into the ravages of sovereignty. You know, there's a beautiful song in Coldplay, I used to rule the world, seas would rise when I gave the word. Now I sleep alone. I sweep the streets I used to own. Revolutionaries wait for my head on a silver plate. Just a puppet on a lonely string. Oh, who would ever want to be king? These sorts of insights, they go amiss in the decrepit proto-plutocracy of the wannabe aristocratic revolutionaries who are more corrupt than the sovereign. I mean, there's also a secret history of some sovereigns who have dressed up as common folk to involve themselves in the middle classes because they saw more value in the middle classes than perhaps, or at least in some echelons of the middle classes, some taverns of the middle classes, some circles in the middle classes than even their own station. And that there is a mystery in the nobility of the individual that needs to somewhat be disentangled from the pool of darkness in the cave of the realm of the intelligible, as Carl Jung prophesied. So I'm just bringing us back to this perennial problem to be solved before we can actually make any real ground on this matter. And I would say that justification is and in some sense, I guess in some sense, I think identity is the enemy of this, but in some sense you also have to make peace with identity on some level, that you need to integrate identity with an idea of justice, a system of justice. Because identity does have a lot of this toxic waste built within it, a lot of this projective conjecture, a lot of this convenient gainsaying and such and such. Anyway, let me stop this recording.